Welcome everyone to another manga review. This time we have My Hero Academia, Chapter 230, title Sad Man's Parade. And the sad man in question this time is, or every time pretty much, is Double. He has finally clicked through his mental blocks, his paranoia, his various medical, psychological issues, and managed to go and unlock the potential of his quirk properly. In the end of last chapter, he was left a bit. He was left in a precarious situation as he was being attacked by fake copies and clones of himself made by the Liberation Army, and as they were attacking him, they injured him severely, broke his arms, and in the moment that happened, he realized that he hadn't disappeared, meaning that he was the real him, which is what allowed him to get past his mental blocks and get past his psychological trauma, being uncertain whether he is really himself or not, and is when he decides to say forget about it and just let loose, allowing himself to create just a ridiculous number of clones in order to save Toga. And he managed to do it. He, in the chapter, it seems roughly around 10,000 clones, or 20,000 I think is a number stated by one of the clones, and he's basically making an entire small town or city all by himself to take on the Liberation Army, and it's really surprising. We also get at the very beginning a brief moment of exposition as to the extent of Double's powers and how they really work. Double is able to, as it is explained in this, create a double of essentially anything and anyone. It's not limited to people or anything biological. He can replicate things as well. It was shown he was trying to replicate the bullet that the Yakuza members had used to take away people's powers momentarily. And in this flashback, we find out that while he is able to copy pretty much anything, he needs some sort of blueprint, some sort of information about what it is, how it's made. He needs to know exactly what a thing is and how it works and how to make it happen, basically. Which is more reminiscent of Momo's powers, as she can just create anything from her body. Except the limitations for him and her are very different. With Momo, her limitations are that the material for whatever she's making comes from her fat cells, which I'm not going to get into that, but there's only a limited amount that she can make because of that. It also requires that the surface area that she uses to make it be available, so that's why it's explained away, the fan service of her being so lightly dressed in her hero costume. With Double, he doesn't have either of those limitations. Instead, his only limitation is, aside from having to know the material, which, since he's not as bright or as textbook focused as Momo, he doesn't quite have the knowledge and ability to do as much as she does. He does have his other downside is primarily that everything he makes is much weaker than the original. And I believe there is a moment in which it describes that subsequent models, subsequent copies will be weaker than the previous copy, and that in order to make a copy of something else, he has to end his original copy. So there are some rules and regulations to the way that he can use his power, but it's still an incredibly powerful ability, something that would allow him to really just take over the world if he really put his mind to it. I was imagining just earlier, if he, copied anything and was able to have some level of control over it, which he does appear to have over his clones, at least to some extent, at least before his mental breakdown in which they all tried to kill themselves and each other. But if he does exert any amount of control, and he was able to copy, say, All for One X many times, even if each subsequent copy is a little weaker and a little more prone to dying, they still have the powers of All for One, making Double just a absolute powerhouse. And this is why the Liberation Army really wants him around. They want to capture him rather than kill him in order to hold his abilities in case that their leader or someone higher up in their standing is grievously injured or dies. They're able to he's able to make another copy and have them continue the same work. This chapter focuses on just how powerful Double has become after having situated his own psychological problems and let loose, as thousands and thousands of copies of him fill the streets and flood this entire town like an actual flowing flood. And he catches up to Dabi and Compress as they're fighting some of the other Liberation Army members. Dabi's fighting off against that ice user from the previous chapter who can control and call forth ice from his surroundings to attack. It's made clear, though, in this chapter that he has powers that go beyond that. He claims that he can control the temperature of his ice, which is a wild and dumb thing to say. Oh, I can make my ice colder or warmer, but that just makes it into water. So, I don't know. This character is basically just a waterbender who focuses on ice, and the roundabout description of it is unnecessary. But it seems that the ice has to be ice first in order for him to get control of it in the first place. To get more water into ice, to use more, to have more ice to fight with, he apparently has been controlling some of the ice to go into the water supply of the town, into the sewers, making the ice become even colder, freezing the water around it in order to gain control of that as well. Which, while interesting and definitely a fun way to make use of a seemingly limited power, is still ridiculous, and Todoroki is far superior in every way to this slump. And is facing off against Dabi, who's having some difficulties despite his incredibly powerful fire quirk, being able to produce the blue fire to burn everything down. And the Ice Man has even noted in this chapter that Dabi seems to be reaching some sort of limit, some sort of quirk limitation. Noting that the patches of skin, seeing as the majority of Dabi's body is just scarred, burned tissue, there are some pieces such as the bit of face that he staples to himself in just the most disgusting way, and his hands that the skin on which is held on like gloves. Dabi is an incredibly disgusting character, realistically speaking. If there was ever a live action adaptation, I don't want to look at him, but he's really cool. And Iceman notes that the flesh that he still has on seems to be loosening and inflamed and having some sort of adverse reactions as Dabi continues to fight. And there's a note made that Dabi is an incredibly efficient fighter, usually manages to defeat his enemies rather quickly. And this particular fight is not quite going that way. It's having more of a drawn out battle, which is what has led to his limitations being on the horizons. And it's interesting to see where his powers will evolve to and what abilities or potential limit breaks he'll reach as well. As we've seen that this battle arc is more of a drawn out or more of a elongated training arc. In a lot of shonen manga, we get these training arcs where we'll look at a character having a little montage fight, and then we'll turn away, and in a few chapters we'll see the results of that fight. In this, it's much more we get to see them do the actual training, the actual fighting, see the points in which they manage to break through whatever is going on and imagine another ability, or you develop a new technique. And that's really interesting to actually get to see these chapters, these moments, seeing as they're not very common in this medium. And it's made these chapters, despite being a bit formulaic in that we see a character, we see them go up against an enemy that they're not quite able to defeat, and then develop a new power and then win. It's been that for Toga, and it's gonna happen probably for each of the characters individually, and that might be a little boring to some, but I find it to be far more interesting in the way that it's done. The way it's implemented is incredibly practical, and I find it to be a lot more fun than it sounds. But it's Dabi and Compress. They're fighting off some foes when Double shows up and informs everyone, we're here, we're powerful, we're ready to take everyone down. And everyone has, at least Compress has a moment of, wow, you're doing this wild thing, holy crap, there's so many of you. And Double even suggests, all right, let me double you guys up, let me make hundreds of copies of you, and we'll just steamroll everyone here and win. And it's that moment that Compress reminds Double, and honestly me as well, that one of the reasons they came here wasn't just to fight the Liberation Army and win and take back their ally, who the evil villain recruiter, basically. Instead, their plan was to do that, but also to hold off the Liberation Army long enough that the giant monster that they have to defeat in order to gain its allegiance to be on the same level as their as All for One. Their plan was to be there, fight them, and wait long enough for it to wake back up and chase after them, being the unstoppable juggernaut force that it is, and fight the Liberation Army, killing them, and them hopefully weakening it enough that they are able to finish it off. And I had completely forgot about this entire subplot, seeing as each chapter was so focused on an individual character developing new abilities and growing. I was a bit engrossed in that, but in the chapter we see that issue come back up, and they mentioned that it's about an hour or so away from waking back up and getting into the fight. But we turn over to the mad scientist that's been their new benefactor, their doctor, basically. And he calls to the monster and wakes it up a little earlier, and it seems like everything's gonna come to a climax real soon. Not sure if each character of the remaining characters is gonna get their own development, their own power evolution, their own moments of character growth, I guess, as the ones that's Toga and Double and not Todoroki, Hands Man. They've all had some sort of evolution, and I'm interested to see if the rest of them will, or if by the introduction of the monster, that's gonna the pattern will be shifting or changing to something new. But all in all, that's the majority of the chapter, is just setting up for the introduction of the monster into the battlefield, showing off the extent to which Double's power can be used to overwhelm an entire city, and to introduce potentially Dabi's limitations, seeing as beforehand it seemed that he had none, with this ability to just create incredibly potent fire. Yeah, that's this week's chapter of My Hero Academia. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you next week.